Hey.
What you want to say about the baby?
Good time, baby.
A 4-year-old girl was reported missing on a summer night. Search teams covered thousands of acres. A helicopter, drones, dogs, more than 200 people. But investigators now say that search was already too late before it even began. This case involves the death of a child. Viewer discretion is advised. Stay with us, because what investigators uncovered explains something most coverage of this case still hasn't caught up to. If you're new here, subscribe now. We break these cases down using confirmed evidence, not speculation. Drop a comment and let us know where in the world you're watching from. On the night of June 30th, a woman called 911 from a home in Aiken County, South Carolina.
I can't find my baby. I was outside playing, and I came out here after cooking dinner a little bit, and I'm looking for her, but I don't see her nowhere. She has on pink Minnie Mouse pajamas, and she had in pink beads. She had braids.
She told the dispatcher her daughter had been playing outside. She said she went inside to cook dinner. When she came back out, the little girl was gone. She gave an address. She gave a description. She stayed on the line for several minutes, answering questions calmly. Within hours, multiple law enforcement agencies, including the FBI, had mobilized a search across thousands of acres. A summer heat wave pushed conditions into the triple digits, while volunteers and officers searched through the day. That search would not find the child alive. According to arrest warrants filed days later, investigators believe she had already been dead for about a month before that phone call was ever made. This is not a missing child case. It's a case about what happens in the weeks between a tragedy and a confession, and what finally forced that gap to close. Her name was Javeayah Harris. She was 4 years old. Those who knew her described a child who was affectionate with everyone she met. Her father later told a reporter she had no sense of stranger danger at all, that she was polite and open with anyone, the kind of child who would say yes ma'am and no ma'am to people she'd just met. Early reports suggested she may have been autistic or nonverbal. Authorities later clarified that this information was inaccurate. She was described by her own mother in the 911 call as a child who could carry a full conversation. No Amber Alert was issued when she was reported missing. Officials confirmed the case did not meet the state's criteria for activation at that time, a detail that drew questions from the public and is worth stating plainly here. Javeayah's parents were Michelle Herring, 22 years old, and Javeayah Harris, 23 years old. Herring worked at a company called Transcom. Harris worked at DHL. Court records show a previous eviction filing against Harris that was later resolved and marked as settled. Records also show an earlier domestic disturbance call involving both of them at a residence they'd shared before moving to Aiken. According to that report, officers responded to a dispute connected to Harris moving out of the home. Herring told officers at the time that she did not want certain family members coming to the property to help him collect his things. The report does not describe physical violence between them. It's included here only because it's part of the public record, not because it explains what came later. Neither parent had a documented history of prior criminal charges related to child welfare before this case. What investigators allege happened in the weeks before June 30th is what changes that. Arrest warrants allege that Javeayah suffered a serious injury sometime between the 1st of May and the 15th of June, a window of roughly 6 weeks before the emergency call was made. The warrants state the injury resulted from physical abuse and that neither parent sought medical treatment for her afterward. Herring and Harris were both arrested and charged with homicide by child abuse. Herring faces an additional charge of filing a false police report. Investigators say the warrants are supported by statements made by both parents during questioning. A statement made to investigators is not the same as testimony tested in open court. Neither parent has retained an attorney as of their last hearing, and both were found ineligible for a court-appointed lawyer based on their income. What's written in the warrants reflects probable cause. It is not a conviction. There is one meaningful distinction between the two warrants. Investigators allege the injury was caused specifically by Herring. Harris is charged based on an allegation that he knew about the injury and failed to seek help for her, a different level of alleged responsibility than causing the harm directly. One thing has not been made public in any warrant or statement so far. Investigators have not disclosed why the injury happened in the first place. No motive has been confirmed, and this script will not speculate on one. What follows is what has been confirmed, not a guess at what caused it. 6 weeks is the number that defines this case. That's the length of time investigators allege passed between the injury and the phone call reporting Javeayah missing. 6 weeks of two people going to work, coming home, and saying nothing. Cases like this tend to follow a pattern that investigators have seen before in similar circumstances. The first decision to stay silent is the hardest one to make. After that, each additional day raises the cost of coming forward. Early on, there might have been a simpler explanation available. Weeks later, the silence itself becomes something that would also need to be explained. When two people share that silence, it reinforces itself. Speaking up doesn't just mean admitting what happened. It means breaking an agreement the two of you have been keeping together, whether or not it was ever spoken aloud. That is the mechanism behind 6 weeks of nothing, not one moment of panic, but a decision made and remade every day, growing harder to undo each time. But there was one thing coming that neither of them could put off. Javeayah Harris was 39 weeks pregnant. That detail sounds unrelated to everything else in this case. It isn't. Hospital intake for childbirth routinely includes a standard question for any parent with another child on record. Where is your other child? That question was coming, whether Harris wanted it to or not. She could not delay her due date. She could not skip hospital intake. And she could not answer that question honestly, without explaining 6 weeks of silence. According to analysis from a former prosecutor familiar with cases built on similar circumstances, the timing of the missing child report lines up directly with this. Not a breakdown. A way to have an answer ready before anyone had the chance to ask the question. Harris gave birth the same night the search for Javeayah began. The newborn was placed with a family member in the days that followed, with the state's child welfare agency confirmed to be involved. 2 hours mattered more in this case than almost anything else. The hours between a phone call and a delivery room. If this breakdown is giving you more than the headlines did, that's exactly why we make these. Subscribe so you don't miss the next update on this case, and tell us in the comments what part of this timeline stood out to you most. The search for Javeayah began around her family's home in Aiken County before eventually shifting roughly 2 hours north near the Fairfield and Chester County line, close to a reservoir known locally as Stumpy Pond. State wildlife officers led the water search, supported by boats, drone teams, and canine units. Cell service in the area was limited, and weather at times slowed the search. Local sheriff's offices kept the access roads restricted to law enforcement only. The FBI confirmed its involvement throughout the investigation, assisting with neighborhood canvasses, digital evidence review, behavioral analysis, and resources typically used in child abduction cases. That level of federal support signals how seriously the case was treated from the very first day, well before anyone suspected the initial story was false. Public records show both parents had prior ties to the part of the state where the search eventually concentrated. According to the warrants, Harris indicated Javeayah had been taken to a location away from the family home, consistent with where investigators focused their efforts. By the end of that week, officials confirmed they no longer believed Javeayah was alive. 1 week after the initial call, investigators returned to the family's home, this time accompanied by staff from the county coroner's office. For several hours, they worked the property systematically, using fine mesh sifting equipment typically used to locate small physical evidence in soil, not the kind of equipment used in a routine walkthrough. Items were recovered and logged using numbered evidence markers. A structure in the yard was also photographed as part of the scene. A law enforcement source described this work as evidence collection, separate from the search happening at the reservoir 2 hours away. Here is why that distinction matters. A statement to investigators tells them what someone says happened. Physical evidence tells them what the record actually supports. When the two match, an account holds up under scrutiny. When they don't, the physical evidence becomes what matters most in front of a jury. On July 9th, Aiken County Sheriff Marty Sawyer confirmed that some of Javeayah's remains had been recovered from the reservoir in Fairfield County. DNA testing conducted by the state's law enforcement division confirmed the remains were consistent with being the biological child of both parents. Sheriff Sawyer said the investigation showed extensive and deliberate efforts had been made to conceal what happened to Javeayah after her death. As a result of these findings, both parents now face an additional charge of destruction and desecration of human remains, on top of the homicide and false report charges already filed. Sawyer, a 37-year veteran of law enforcement, said it is unlikely that all of Javeayah's remains will ever be recovered. He called it one of the most difficult and emotionally taxing investigations his office has ever handled. He also said something that stayed with a lot of people who have followed this case. He would not refer to Herring and Harris using the words mother or father. He said they had not earned that. Both parents appeared before Magistrate Judge Ronald Thornton on July 5th. Neither had an attorney present. Both were denied bond. The charges against them carry a mandatory minimum of 20 years, with a maximum sentence of life in prison. A magistrate does not have the authority to set bond on charges at that level. That decision now goes to a circuit court judge, expected to be scheduled within 30 days of the initial hearing. Here is what that actually means for anyone unfamiliar with how a case like this moves forward. A circuit court bond hearing will determine whether either parent can be released before trial and under what conditions. Separately, prosecutors will present the case to a grand jury for indictment, formalizing the charges before any trial date is set. Only after indictment does a realistic trial timeline begin to take shape, and cases involving charges this serious often take many months, sometimes longer, to reach that stage. Their first scheduled court appearance is set for September 18th. It's worth being clear here. Warrants establish probable cause. A conviction requires proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Those are two different standards, and the distance between them is what the coming months of legal proceedings will test. No trial has taken place. No verdict has been reached. This case is still in its early legal stages, and this channel will follow it as it develops. Outside the family's home on Hillsborough Street, a memorial has grown day by day, left mostly by people who never met Javeayah or her family. A local restaurant owner delivered meals to search crews working through a holiday weekend. A candlelight vigil in Aiken drew a large crowd with no single organizer behind it. Additional vigils have since been held in neighboring communities, with mourners wearing pink in her memory. One woman who attended a vigil said simply that the case had touched her deeply, that she found herself needing to call her own daughter just to hear her voice. The response reflects something simple: a community choosing to stay present in a case it has no power to resolve on its own. As of today, both parents remain in custody without bond. Additional charges have been filed. The investigation is still active, and their next court date is September 18th. What began as a missing child report has become a case built on 6 weeks of silence, a court date that couldn't be avoided, and physical evidence that took investigators more than a week to uncover. The warrants lay out an allegation. The months ahead, through indictment and eventually trial, will decide whether the evidence supports it in full. If you have information related to this case, contact local law enforcement or your state's tip line. If this breakdown helped you understand this case more clearly than the headlines did, subscribe so you don't miss what comes next as this case moves toward trial. Tell us in the comments what you think investigators are still working to confirm.